3 days after the Hiroshima mission, the 509th Squadron was in the air again. This time they were carrying a plutonium atomic bomb, more powerful than the uranium bomb used in Hiroshima. The primary target was the city of Kokura, but the crew could not find a break in the clouds to see the aiming point, and so low on fuel they moved on to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The plutonium bomb detonated with the force of almost 20,000 tons of TNT, 50% more power than the Hiroshima bomb. Because the bombardier was off target, the casualties were equivalent to Hiroshima, about 160,000. The flash burns, however, were often more severe. Today, many Japanese say they might understand why the first atomic bomb was used, but not the second.
I think the Americans wanted to see how the bombs they made would work. They wanted to experiment, to see how the Japanese people would be burned by their different types of atomic bombs. Therefore, I am not able to forgive those people who want to make the whole thing sound all right.
The Nagasaki bomb was the final straw for Japan. The emperor told his people that they must endure the unendurable and surrender. Among the first Americans to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the war was a documentary film crew which shot these rare color images. The U.S. military ordered this film to be locked away for 30 years. They apparently worried it would raise too much public opposition to the use of nuclear weapons. For weeks, the makeshift hospitals were choked with thousands of victims, many of whom were now experiencing the illnesses associated with exposure to X-rays emitted from the bomb. Also visiting Hiroshima at the time was a scientist who helped build the atomic bomb, Philip Morrison.
There were still 1,000 people or so lying on the railroad platform, which had leaky roofs. The rain would drizzle in on these people. They were all radiation casualties, all ill from radiation sickness, getting ready to die, dying there on the platform. That was, of course, very, very moving.
Just days after the death of her 2 children, Shin Bok-soo's husband developed radiation sickness.
His hair started to fall out, and his gums turned black red. He started suffering from high fever. He was going crazy, screaming, "I don't want to die. I'm not going to die." He died the next morning.
Many radiologists came to Hiroshima to examine the victims. American scientist Philip Morrison was shaken by an encounter with one Japanese expert who had studied in the United States.
He came to me and he showed me his papers from Philadelphia, which contained, strangely enough, studies of whole body radiation on dogs. And he said, we studied such radiation only on a few dozen dogs, but you Americans have carried on the human experiment. Of course, a wonderful, ironic comment, absolutely dead true.
Debate about the propriety of using the atomic bomb began in earnest with the official post-war report of the United States Strategic Bomb Survey Team, which concluded that the use of the world's first nuclear weapons was unnecessary, that Japan was already beaten and ready to surrender.
One can only look back and wish that the atomic bombs had not been dropped.
One of the authors of that report was the American economist John Kenneth Galbraith.
I look back on it as one of the great tragedies of all time. Why there had to be 2, I never understood. Why it had to be on a city, I never understood. I think those are real issues.
What are they trying to do? Are they trying to prove that Harry Truman was wrong? Are they trying to prove that our great country was wrong, that America was wrong?
Now, on the 50th anniversary of the atomic bomb, the debate about its morality has been reignited by 2 historical exhibits, one in Washington and one in Japan. Today in Hiroshima, where honoring the A-bomb victims is an everyday activity, there is also a constant re-examination of the controversial questions about the Second World War. Recently, a new wing was added to the city's Peace Museum. There had been complaints that the old museum only documented Hiroshima's war experience, starting with the bomb explosion, portraying the Japanese only as victims. The new wing illustrates the long history of Japanese militarism, showing how Japan's wartime leadership was responsible for the destruction of the country. The new approach was an initiative of Hiroshima's mayor, Takashi Hiraoka, who believes Japan must come to terms with its responsibility for starting the war.
Wars always have assailants and victims. We planned this exhibit to learn about both roles, so that we will never repeat the same tragedy.
Across the Pacific Ocean, another museum has been struggling to come to terms with how Americans should look back at the end of the Second World War. A ferocious debate has blown up around the newly restored plane that dropped the Hiroshima bomb. Here at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, they wanted to mark the 50th anniversary of the atomic bomb by designing an exhibit around the Enola Gay. They decided not to just display the plane in the normal celebratory fashion, but to address some of the historical controversies surrounding the decision to drop the bomb. They had no idea what they were getting into. The historians at the Smithsonian decided that museum visitors should not just look at the famous airplane. They should also consider the effect the bombs created on the ground in Japan. The curators plan to borrow some exhibits from the Hiroshima Peace Museum. A watch that is frozen forever at the time the bomb went off, 8:15. A young boy's tricycle that was left behind when he was burned to death. A girl's school lunchbox, still filled with peas and rice, carbonized in the explosion that killed her. The inclusion of such items by the Smithsonian upset the pilots who dropped the bomb.
They're not trying to explain anything. They're trying to show how terrible the weapon was. You know, it incinerates a poor little schoolgirl's lunchbox and her lunch. That doesn't explain the war. It just explains what happened at that particular instance.
The original plan for the Smithsonian exhibit also included information about how the Japanese were trying to surrender in early 1945, evidence that the bomb was not required to end the war. The planned exhibit questioned whether an American invasion of Japan would have been required, and pointed out that the numbers of American casualties expected in such an invasion have been wildly exaggerated over the years since the original estimate was made. Harry Truman claimed the bomb saved millions of lives.
They say that only 30,000 would have been killed. Well, let's say it would have been 60,000 or 600,000. Or let's go back to 30,000. Those 30,000 lives were precious to me. Those 30,000 beautiful American young men were beautiful to me, if not to the economists and not to the revisionist historians.
The point is, they think their lives were saved because they were told that.
Historian Gar Alperovitz is a leading expert on the atomic bomb.
Now, what we now know is that the war could have been ended, at least most historians understand, who are experts in the field, could have been ended without the bomb, and their lives would have been saved anyway. So it's not a case that the bomb saved their lives. The bomb mainly destroyed an awful lot of people without saving many lives.
Faced with rising protests, the Smithsonian directors entered into negotiations to try and appease veterans organizations which were complaining about the exhibit. The Smithsonian agreed to a dramatic increase in the photos of American casualties elsewhere in the Pacific. Illustrations of the suffering of Japanese victims were substantially reduced. Also eliminated under pressure from veterans was evidence that prominent U.S. military leaders, such as Dwight Eisenhower and Admiral William Leahy, were against the dropping of the bomb. Leahy wrote in 1950 that America had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. The quote was eliminated.